Hello, Infiniteers. It is Friday, and that means it's time for my next episode of Toy Box Tutorials. We've been away from this series for a little while, but I'm ready to resume it, and so that's what we're going to do today. For those of you who are new to my channel, I try to post 2 to 3 videos per week. My regular series airs on Mondays and Wednesdays, and when I do produce a third video, it airs on Fridays, and it's usually for a different series. Right now, my Friday series is Toy Box Tutorials, and this series teaches you how to use the Toy Box mode in Disney Infinity 3.0 and the various toys within the game. And today we're going to look at another new Creativi-toy that was added for Disney Infinity 3.0, and that is the player counter. And you can find this toy in the Creativi-toys drawer in the editor. You may have to purchase this out of the toy store first, but we'll drop one up here around this corner so we can kind of play around with it. And to help us do that, I've placed a button out of the Creativi-toys drawer and a color changing block out of the basic blocks drawer. Alright, now this is another 3.0 logic toy that I have never seen anyone create a tutorial for, and so I think mine might be the first. Now the player counter is a very handy toy. It keeps track of the number of active players in your game, and it will broadcast different logic connections when the number of players changes. You can also query this toy at any time to request the current number of players who are active in the game, and this can be very useful if you want to only do something when there's more than one player, or you want to do something different depending on how many players you have. So let's look at the logic menu for this. You'll notice there are no properties. We have some logic connections though, and there's also some behaviors which I'll cover in a moment. But if we open up this, there are 5 trigger signals and some sub-signals here that this will broadcast depending on what happens. So when a new player joins the game, this trigger signal is broadcast, player joined. And when a player drops out and leaves, this signal is broadcast. So those are pretty straightforward. And these happen without you having to do anything. It will also broadcast this signal in addition to these to let you know that the player count changed. And if we select this, actually let's do this one first. So when a player joins, if I select this, you'll notice there's a set of sub-signals here, and it will let you know, now that somebody has joined, how many players we have total. Again, these two you can ignore because we don't have online multiplayer in 3.0 anymore. We only have 2 players, so these are the only 2 signals you really have to worry about. Likewise, when a player drops out, if we select this, it'll let you know how many players total you now have now that somebody has left the game. And again, usually what this is going to tell you if somebody left the game is you're going to have 1 player total. Whenever the player count changes because somebody joined or dropped out, this gets broadcast, and again, this lets you know how many players you have. And again, you can hook these signals up to whatever toys you need, depending on whether you have 1 or 2 players. Now, these 2 signals happen as a result of a query, and that's due to a behavior. So let me exit out of this for a moment, and we'll come over to the button. So if you want to know at any given moment, you're not keeping track as somebody logs in and leaves, but when you go to start a game, for example, like a challenge, which we'll do in a moment, and you want to know how many players you have, you can come, for example, to the button and do a new logic connection when this is pressed. We're just using the button as an example. But you can come over to the player counter, and there's several behaviors here. You can query the number of active players. And so if we do that, for example, and then you come over to the player counter, the trigger signal that gets broadcast is the query result number of active players. And if you select that, you can hook this up depending on how many players you have. So if, for example, somebody joins the game and we now have 2 players total, we can use that to turn our color changing block green. And we can do a new logic connection. When the query's result comes back with just 1 player, we can change this back to the default gray. So I can use restore. Alright, so if we come out here, we only have 1 player right now. And so if I push the button, nothing should happen to that color changing block, because the query result is we have 1 player. But if I bring in Minnie, I'll put her on the base.
Oh, hello there. I just know we're going to be best friends.
And now we push the button. Now that color changing block turns green, because now we have 2 players. And if we have Minnie drop out, we are now back down to 1 player. So when I query the player counter, now we have 1 player. Now it's back to the default gray. So that tells you how that works. And let's go ahead and delete that signal. And before we show you the other one, let's demo the other trigger signals here. So let me open this up. We're going to delete those 2. And let's do a new logic connection and see how this works dynamically. So when a player joins, and we now have 2 players total, we'll come over to our block and change it green. And on the player counter, a new logic connection. When a player drops out, and we now have 1 player total, we'll restore the block to the default gray. Okay, so now we'll come out of the editor, and now when we bring Minnie in, you see the block already changed green. So it knew right away that another player was joining the game. And if we have Minnie drop out, immediately that changes back to green, or to gray. So I didn't have to do anything. It automatically updated depending on whether a player joined or left. Let's go ahead and delete those. Now if you just want to know when the player count changed and you don't care whether somebody joined or dropped out, you can do the same thing with this. So when there's 1 player total, we'll restore on the block. When the player count changes and we have 2 players total, we turn it green. And so basically that same trigger signal works the same as the other 2. So now once again we bring Minnie in, it changes green. Yep, off you go. You're going to drop out again. And it changes back to gray. So those first 3 trigger signals happen automatically. They're dynamic depending on when somebody joins or drops out. And we've looked at that. The last one is query result player's active status. And that, again, is driven off of a behavior. So let me delete these 2. Exit out of that. We'll come back to our button. Do a new logic connection when pressed. Come over here to the player counter. And if we query all players' active status, all right, and then you come in here, do a new logic connection, that will cause this trigger signal to broadcast, which is player's active status. And then likewise you can do player 1 or 2. So you can determine whether or not you have a second player. So we'll do player 2, and we'll change this to green. Okay. And now we'll bring Minnie in. She doesn't know if she's coming or going.
Okay, off I go.
All right, so now we push the button and we're asking for the status of player 2. Do we have a player 2? And the answer is yes. It broadcasts that signal. Okay. And let's put down another button here just to clear that block. And so we'll do a new logic connection when pressed. And we'll put that back the way it was. Alright, so we'll push that button. That puts the block back to gray. And now let's have Mini drop out. Goodbye, Mini. Alright, so now we push this button, and again we're querying whether we have a player 2. And this did not broadcast that trigger signal because we don't have a player 2. And so this never turned green. Okay, so that's how that trigger signal works. So let me go ahead and delete that link. And we'll do another logic connection when pressed. Let's look at some other behaviors. So that was querying all players' active status. If you only want to know whether you have a player 2 or not, you can query player 2's active status. And that will cause the same logic connection to fire that we've already established. Player 2's active status. Okay? So the idea here, though, whoops, let's let me go ahead and put down another one, just so I can make the point. We're not going to keep this button, but so if we do new logic connection when pressed, you could come in here and query player 1's status, player 2's status. You're actually always going to have player 1, so you don't have to worry about that. You're never going to have a player 3 or 4, so you don't have to worry about those because we don't have online multiplayer. So really, this is the only one you ever need to do. Okay. Now, if you query this one and you hook that up to this toy, this is going to broadcast 2 trigger signals. It's going to broadcast player 1's active status, and if there's a player 2, it's going to broadcast player 2's status. All right. If you only have one player, it'll only broadcast this one. And the difference here is by querying for the specific player, player 2's active status, then this toy is only going to broadcast that trigger signal there if there's a player 2. Okay, so that's the difference between those two behaviors, whether you're querying all the players' active status or a particular one. And once again, since we're querying player 2's active status specifically, and I can't remember if I demoed this, but I think you get the idea. But let's just go ahead and bring in Mini anyway. And we'll hit the button and you can see.
Okay, off I go.
So now we have player 2. And I'll reset. Mini drops out. And we press the button and nothing happens. So basically those two queries did the exact same thing. Alright, so that's all well and good. How are you going to use this toy now? What can you do with it? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at that with a simple little game over here that I've got set up. And I've built a little western town here, as you can see. And the idea here is that we're going to create a shooting contest for 1 or 2 players. I have 2 identical paths down here. You can see I've laid these out both the same. And I'm going to connect a target to each path. And I've already placed the target ahead of time. And the first player to shoot the moving target 10 times wins. We're going to use these object generators here to give each player the exact same gun to use. And the players will shoot from these wooden platforms here. And if they step over it and get too close to the target, they'll hit this trigger area and will fail the game. Now, if we only have one player, then we don't need to create this second gun, and we don't need to start the target moving along this path. And so we're going to use the player counter to decide if we need those toys. All right? So this is a fairly simple little game to hook up. It should go fairly quick, but let's start. Let's start with the scoreboard. I think that's going to be pretty straightforward. And again, I've only placed these toys ahead of time. We have our new player counter. I've placed a scoreboard, 2 object generators, a challenge maker, a couple of locators for the starting position of each player, the trigger area, 2 targets, and 2 paths. All right. So let's set the properties on these things first. So under the properties, we've turned on the loop flag and we've turned off auto start objects when connected. All right, everything else stays the same. And we're going to do the same thing over here. Turned on looped after I drew it, turned off auto start objects when connected. And I'll connect those targets in a moment. On the scoreboard, if we go into the properties, we're going to have them play to 10 points, 10 shots, and the rest of these fields stay the same. Again, there are no properties on the player counter. I'm not going to worry about properties on the object generators. And all of the properties on the challenge maker, we're going to leave these set the way they are by default. I'm not going to change anything in here. All right, so on the challenge maker, we'll do a new locator connection. We'll have player 1 start over here. New locator connection, sorry. Have player 2 start over here. And before we get to the player counter, let's just hook up a few preliminary things. We'll hook up the scoreboard next. So a new logic connection, excuse me, on invites accepted. We'll come over to our scoreboard and reset. On the challenge maker, a new logic connection. When the game is started, we will activate the scoreboard. On the challenge maker, a new logic connection. When the game is ended, we will deactivate the scoreboard. On the challenge maker, we need to do a new score results connection. Connect that up to the scoreboard so we can see the results at the end. And then on the scoreboard, we'll do a new logic connection. When the target score is reached, so when somebody hits 10 hits, we'll come over to the challenge maker and complete the game. Okay? All right, so that takes care of a lot of the preliminary stuff here. All right, so for player 1, we want to just go ahead and set up that object generator directly. So on invites accepted, we'll come over to our object generator. We'll go under the tools menu and we'll select the flintlock. Now on player 2, I only want to do that for this if we have a player 2. Okay, so on the challenge maker, we're going to do a new logic connection. On invites accepted, we'll come over to our player counter and we're going to query player 2's active status. All right, and on the player counter, a new logic connection. If we have a player 2, then we'll come over here and select the flintlock. Okay, so if we don't have a player 2, this will never broadcast that trigger signal, and this will never get initialized. Okay, so that should be fairly straightforward. Before we hook up the paths, let's go ahead and hook these targets up. So this will be player 1's target, so a new logic connection on that. When that's hit, we're going to come to the scoreboard and increment player 1's score. Increment by 1 score for player 1. And likewise on this target, when that one is hit, we'll increment player 2's score. All right, and then now we'll go ahead and connect this target up to this path. We'll connect this target up to that path. On the challenge maker, we can do a new logic connection on invites accepted. We'll come over to the path creator and we'll do a reset and play. And again, we only want to start this path if we have a player 2. We've already connected up the challenge maker to query the result on the query player 2 status rather on the player counter. So on the player counter, we just need to make another connection, a new logic connection, player's active status, player 2. So if we have a player 2, we'll come over to our path over here and do a reset and play. All right, so we're only going to display the flintlock and put that here and only start the path if we have a player 2. All right, a few other connections to make here. When the game is ended, we'll stop the paths. So a new logic connection on the challenge maker. When the game is ended, we'll do a reset and stop, and we'll do that on both paths. Doesn't hurt to stop a path that isn't moving. So we don't need to check if the player 2 is in here or not. Okay, so that's done. We've hooked up the targets, we've hooked up the object generators, we've hooked up the player counter. All we have left is the trigger area. And so on the trigger area, we will do a new logic connection when entered by player any. We'll come over here and fail the game. Game failed. And that automatically creates multiple connections. And you want to come in here and delete the other 4 connections it just made. Because when entered by player 4, for example, it's logging the player's completion. I don't want to do that. I actually only want to log the game failed. And so we need to delete these ones that it just created automatically. That's the only one we want. And we'll do a new logic connection on the challenge maker on invites accepted. We'll activate this because we probably only want this trigger area active when the game is running. And likewise, when the game is ended, we'll deactivate that. And we should probably hook that up with a trigger or a level starter. So let me pick that up and put it down. Let me come over and pick up the level starter. And on the level starter, we'll do a new logic connection on catalyze and deactivate. Okay. And I think that's everything. Let me just double check my notes. Link the score results. Level starters hooked up. Trigger areas hooked up. Yep, I think we're good. All right, let's see what happens. So we only have one player right now, so when I start the challenge, this should remain empty, and that should not move down there. But the one on the left should. So we'll start the challenge. I saw the target on the left is moving. And we have our flintlock, and we do not have one over there. So because we do not have a player 2, we're not using those toys over there. That part of the game mode isn't working. So we come in here, and you can see the counter is working, the scoreboard rather. There we go. Alright, so you get the idea. And I could waste your time by trying to hit that and prove that the game will actually end when I hit 10 targets, but you get the idea. So let me go ahead and end the challenge. Yes. Alright. Now let's bring Minnie in.
Okay, off I go.
Alright, so now we step on the challenge maker. And Minnie accepts the invite. And here we go. Both targets started moving. And you can see both object generators have flintlocks. And so now, because we have a second player, both sets of controls are working. Mickey already has his, so he can come up and start shooting. And Minnie can come up and grab hers, and she can start shooting. And of course, if somebody walks ahead and tries to get closer, the game fails. Challenge failed. So there you go. That's how you can use the player counter. It can be a pretty useful toy for certain games. If you want to see another example of how you might use this toy, check out the football game in my sports series, because I used this same toy in that logic as well. Thank you for watching. If you found this tutorial helpful, please hit the like button before you go and leave a comment to let me know what you think of this toy and my little shooting game. I'd love to hear from you. Have a nice weekend.